So one thing that was different about this hearing is that it was the first since the January 6th riot. And as we kind of touched on, one of the yes or no questions that the CEOs were asked was whether they took responsibility for the Stop the Steal movement that culminated in the riot. So Zuckerberg and Pichai demurred. Dorsey said yes, but you have to take into consideration the broader ecosystem. You've done some really thorough reporting on the difficulties and the weaknesses and the response of tech platforms to domestic extremists as opposed to foreign extremists. So, can we start by asking you to just give us a broad overview of what you found in your reporting?
Sure. So my story was inspired by reporting I had done in the past on the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism, which is this cross industry group that YouTube, I believe, Microsoft, Facebook, Twitter, I think those are the founders. They basically came together to start this cross industry group where they would share hashed images that were associated with ISIS and Al Qaeda or foreign terrorist organizations. And this came about due to tremendous pressure that they were facing from the Obama administration and regulatory groups and lawmakers across the EU during the rise of ISIS. And they were going to meetings, with the UK Home Office. They were going to meetings at the White House. These were, intense discussions with people from President Obama on down, asking Silicon Valley to do more to fight the spread of ISIS, which was, like no other terrorist group before it, using social media as a recruitment tool and as a propaganda tool. Just, they had a brand online. They had slogans, they had songs, they had, recipes, and they were just sort of like a cultural phenomenon in addition to being a terrorist organization. And so the companies really banded together. And I remember after Charlottesville, thinking this is an event that very clearly was associated with neo-Nazi groups and white supremacist groups here in the United States. It was planned on Facebook. Why hasn't Facebook, or why haven't any of these companies taken the same approach to domestic extremist groups as they have taken to foreign terrorist organizations? And I wrote a little story about that for Wired at the time. So that was 2017. Fast forward to now, seeing the Capitol riot, I thought the same thing. Have any of those tools that were developed for the purposes of ISIS around the same time that we saw Charlottesville happen, have any of them been deployed against domestic extremist groups? And so that's what sort of inspired me to write this story about the parallel efforts to crack down on foreign terrorists versus domestic terrorists. And, there are technical reasons why it is more challenging to crack down on domestic extremists. For one thing, unlike ISIS, they aren't all so clearly branded. I spoke with someone at Jigsaw, which is a part of Alphabet, and they were saying, part of what made it easy to create this push against ISIS content was the very nature of belonging to ISIS is you needed to publicly profess your association with ISIS. The same may not be true. Like what we've seen in some reports that have come out about the Capitol riot is a lot of these people were not necessarily part of some paramilitary group like the Oath Keepers. They were these sort of just believers just going along with the crowd, inspired by maybe it was the president, maybe it was neighbors, maybe it was friends, but they weren't associated with any one organization, which makes it tricky just from a technical perspective to find the content that needs to be removed. You need to take a step back and say, okay, but the companies also have to set rules about what should be removed. And that's where the political challenges come in, because unlike foreign terrorist organizations in the United States, we do not have designations for domestic terrorist organizations. So while a lot of these companies have for a long time had policies against, very classic hate groups like the KKK, newer organizations like the Oath Keepers, or even things that you wouldn't call an organization but are just sort of a belief system like QAnon, they didn't really have policies against these groups until the lead up to 2020, when they started looking at how dangerous they might become. So you have the technical challenges of these groups being more disparate and diffuse. You have the political challenges of not having a sort of top-down direction from government about who these groups are. And then you have the third challenge, which is having the Trump administration in power. And if anything, a lot of these groups, as we saw on January 6th, were supporters of President Trump. And, you know, for 4 years, these companies faced lashing after lashing about how they were censoring, quote unquote, Trump supporters or conservatives in general. And so we saw these companies sort of repeatedly bending to the Trump administration's wishes and conservatives' criticisms in general, and that complicated the calculus even more. So I think you saw my story tracks from 2017 when Charlottesville happened all the way up till the Capitol riot, and sort of tracks why the approach to domestic extremists lagged the approach to foreign extremists and how that is starting to change. And I do think that January 6th was a wake up call for a lot of these companies, and you saw it in their responses. But obviously, and I think admittedly on their part, they have a long way to go.
So that's incredibly useful in laying out sort of all the different factors, because I think there's this sort of general sense of how did they miss this? How come nothing happened? And I think those are some really sort of tangible, concrete reasons for why. And one of the things that I think you emphasized in the piece, which was really interesting and important, was this political aspect that you're talking about, and about how politically foreign extremists are different. And I think a lot about the difference that political leadership here could have made. Like, for example, you mentioned QAnon, and the House didn't vote to condemn QAnon until October, whereas there was sort of this general sense that why aren't the companies acting far before then? But there wasn't this general sense of why isn't Congress acting to condemn this sort of extremist and fantastical, ridiculous conspiracy theory. And so I'm wondering if you had a sense when talking to the people from the tech companies that you talked to, whether there was this sense that they were waiting for political leadership, like that if political leadership had done something more, that would have opened up much more space for them to act.
Yeah, so it's a very good question. So I spoke with a number of the people who run this work at these companies on the record. I spoke with Brian Fishman at Facebook. He heads their dangerous organizations and counterterrorism work. And I spoke with Nick Pickles at Twitter. And they are not going to admit that they were waiting for a sign from the Trump administration or any administration, because these guys, they will say we work for global companies. We cannot be answering the mandate of any one leader, because the whims of these leaders change, and we don't want to be. There's a reason why we don't take our cues from individual leaders, because we see how that power can be abused. But at the same time, when I asked what are you looking for from the Biden administration, of course they subtly say, you know any signals from government, particularly from intelligence or the FBI, about what we should be watching out for are signals we're going to take into account. They are valuable signals, similar to the work that they've done around coordinated inauthentic activity around the elections. They were taking a lot of cues from law enforcement and from the intelligence community. And so I think they will admit to that part. They'll say, yes, this is an important cue. And yes, we would love, Brian Fishman said, we would love government to, show their footnotes, like tell us if they're going to put out a warning about domestic extremism, why are they putting out this warning? So yes, I think they would like a little bit more collaboration. Would they admit that that's something that they didn't get during the Trump years, or that that's something that they felt like they needed? Not necessarily. But of course, when you talk to employees, who have left the company or who have worked on these issues, they will say, like, absolutely, these companies didn't want to piss off the Trump administration. And you can see that in XYZ explanation. But I will also say that, there are good reasons why we shouldn't want these companies to just follow the lead of every president of the United States, who they say is the most dangerous person in the world or the most dangerous group in the world. Because, it wasn't that long ago that President Trump was saying after Kenosha that, Black Lives Matter protesters were domestic terrorists. And, we have to look back even farther to the civil rights movement and surveillance of groups like the Black Panthers and civil rights leaders. And so, it is very clear how that power can be abused. And I even in my story, I have another example, a man who was working with Facebook on some hackathons around the world. And these hackathons were supposed to address online hate and discrimination. And so it was supposed to deal with all forms of online hate. And he helped run a hackathon in India, and the head of Facebook's India public policy, he says, began pressuring him after that point for the future hackathons he was supposed to run with them to focus on Islamic extremism coming out of Kashmir. And this woman was a very vocal supporter of Modi, and there are obvious issues there with his administration and the treatment of Muslims in the country. So that was something he pushed back on and said, absolutely not. I'm not going to take that mandate from you. And so I think we have to remember, as much as we want government to lead on these issues, it is important not to have these companies just follow the lead of every government around the world, because that's not always going to be the most sage guidance.
I'm interested, and I want to dig in a little more on the law enforcement and intelligence aspect, because I think that in connection with your point about taking the lead of governments or not, there's something interesting to dig into here. So from my perch at Lawfare, I've been really interested in what congressional hearings seem to be showing about the just complete failure of the FBI to anticipate or do basically anything in the run up to January 6th. Now, if we want to be fair, some of this is that the intelligence community obviously is more limited in what it can do when it comes to domestic groups, thanks to, among other things, that pesky First Amendment. But part of it just seems to be a genuine failure on the part of the Bureau to take this threat seriously, which may have to do with fear among people at the FBI about how President Trump might respond to the news that the Bureau was treating his supporters as a potential threat. And in connection with what you were saying about information sharing, I mean, it sounds to me like part of what might have happened on January 6th is that there's kind of a cascade of failures, right? Like if tech companies, if Twitter and Facebook are waiting for the Bureau to say, hey, this might be a problem, and then the Bureau does nothing because they're worried about what happens if Trump gets a hold of it, then the tech companies don't get the signal to sort of say, okay, go, and you end up with just a sort of Rube Goldberg machine of institutions crashing and burning. Does that sound right to you, or am I overstating that?
No, I think that's exactly right. I mean, at the hearing, I think Jack was the most accurate when he took responsibility and said, yes, but you have to look at the broader landscape. And it's absolutely true. I mean, the New York Times, I think it was, had a story recently about how the intelligence community just was not taking the Proud Boys seriously in the lead up to January 6th. And I tweeted something about this because, as part of my reporting, I was surprised actually to learn that Facebook and Twitter, I believe, had banned the Proud Boys in, I think, 2018. So, part of not taking direct orders from the government means that in some cases, maybe rare cases, but in some cases, and certainly the case here, you can see them acting a little bit faster and a little bit more forcefully, because maybe they have the insights that government doesn't have or isn't looking for about how dangerous these groups are becoming. So I think you're absolutely right that it's a cascade of failures. There were law enforcement failures, and then there were failures on the part of the tech companies to prevent these movements from growing and organizing.